Q&A. That helps us sort of make sure we're getting your questions and answers. So, well, let's get this started. Welcome, everyone. I'm Angela Marshall-Hoffman, and I am the current co-VP for programs, but I'm also a past president of OWIT, which is the Organization of Women in International Trade. For those of you who know OWIT, and I see lots of members who are on the line here, OWIT is a global association for women and men, international trade and business. And we have about 3,000 members that impact hundreds of millions of dollars of trade. And we are in North America, we are in LATAM, we are in Africa, many chapters growing in Africa. It's been very exciting, Europe, and growing in Asia. So really excited to have our virtual members as well participating where you may not have a chapter at hand. But the purpose here is to provide our members with educational and development webinars on a broad variety of topics. That can be business and professional development, but also issues related to international trade and specifically your roles. And as we know, our OWIT members span the gamut. We have policy professionals, but we also have entrepreneurs. So as we're working together, last year's series was focused on navigating trade, successfully navigating trade from the knowing your product to how it's made, to how it's moved, to how you market and promote, different tools and toolkit. And this year we are in the Know series. So let's talk a little bit about housekeeping items. So before we kick it off, just remember this is off the record, not for attribution. The programs and materials are protected by U.S. copyright and may not be reproduced, distributed, transmitted, displayed, published, or broadcast without the prior written approval of OWIT. And again, as we talked about the chat box, you can try the chat box, but just in abundance of caution, use the Q&A if you have great questions too. And in fact, I'm going to tee this off with folks, put into our Q&A where you're calling from, where you're dialing in from. We'd love to hear where our members are today. We're going to have Q&A, but this is going to be a fireside chat with Jon and I. So if you have questions along the way, which I'm sure you will, feel free to ask us those questions. And Jon, I'm sure you'll be happy to answer them as we go. So again, I'm very excited that we are welcoming our special guest, Jon Lang, who is a well-known expert in trade and geopolitics. I can tell you that because I worked with him and he's one of the best in the business. So Jon, I'm just thrilled to have you here, not only as an expert, but also as a colleague in trade. So thank you for your time today. So you're here for a very hot topic in our Trade in the Know series. We're calling it Tariffs, 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 which I kind of wake up every morning thinking about when I turn on the TV, like what tariff's going to be here today? Even my mother's asking me, what's a tariff, right? Seems to be the conversation that everybody's having. So this session is going to highlight what you need to know about the current state of play in terms of trade and tariffs and why resiliency matters. We talk about that a lot in terms of your business. We're going to talk about the ABCs and 1, 2, 3s of trade. Yes, we know trade folks, we love to talk in acronyms and numbers. So we're going to decipher that a bit. And then we're going to dive into the current politics around a new term that you've probably heard. Jon Lang, did we think we'd be talking IEEPA 6 months ago? And now we are. And what is IEEPA and how do we use it? What's a counter tariff? What's a reciprocal tariff? So some new trade lexicon that we'll talk about. So I'm going to introduce Jon and then we're going to get into this conversation. So Jon Lang is the head of Eurasia Group's trade and supply chain practice, where you manage and cover global efforts to diversify supply chains, emerging industrial policies, trends in and policy tools for international trade. And you've been busy. I know the last couple of years between COVID, supply chain resiliency, and trade, really working with helping firms navigate the complexities. But he has a great background in this as well. So Jon served as the Director of International Economic Affairs at the White House, National Economic Council, and the National Security Council. And for those of you coming in from our international markets, those are the teams that directly advise the president in terms of trade and trade matters, and also coordinate externally with business and other society members to help input good information to help advise the president. So Jon, you've been in a really cross-section of understanding the economics, but also the policy matters there as well. Led an interagency process, no easy task, on issues trade, international infrastructure investment, debt sustainability, policymaking related to multilateral development banks, and international financial institutions. Jon also served as Senior Director for Global Markets for the Department of Commerce International Trade Administration. And for those of you who know, OWIT has a memorandum of understanding with the Department of Commerce. It's been going for several years where we partner A lot of the trade programs you have in your embassies or international markets have been hosted by our colleagues with the Department of College, the ITA. So great to have that experience as well. And John, you've got a great background, Georgetown University, London School of Economics, Duke University. You've been all over, but really you've taken that knowledge to apply it. And a little bit of a buzz on here at the end. He's going to talk more about his international background and what it's like to work in international trade. So without further ado, I would like to turn it to you, John. Just talk about your journey. You've seen this aspect of trade from so many different lenses, but I'll let you kick off a little bit about yourself before we dive into the fun questions on tariffs.
Yeah, thanks, Angela, and thanks to everyone at OWIT. It's always good to talk to Angela. So, and obviously, a very hot topic and popular time to talk about anything trade related. Um, so a little bit about my background and my journey, and I guess you could correctly describe it as such. So Angela mentioned my role more recently in the White House. That was my second stint in a White House, the first one being with George W. Bush. One of the last things I did in that White House, even though I was more in a political setting on the legislative affairs side, not in the trade specific side, but a lot of trade activity then. I was down in, back at the end down in Bogota working on the U.S.-Colombia Free Trade Agreement. And you go from that to my more recent role in the first Trump White House on trade. You kind of see the full 180 in terms of U.S. trade policy. Um, I guess, my journey overall has been a bit, through the political side, as I mentioned, in U.S. Republican Party politics, and then through a fair amount of commercial strategy consulting. So you mentioned my Duke background, my MBA, and did a fair number of years in commercial strategy consulting. And then back into the policy space. And that's where, that movement back and forth, and particularly between my commercial strategy consulting background and experience, and you mentioned LSE, my kind of economics, my economic policy background, economics experience, and then also my MBA, and then back into trade policy at the White House. It made me appreciate something that I've kind of always appreciated to a degree, but I guess it was more fully fleshed out, is the need for a conversation between, in many companies, between the folks you're going to see in your average corporate affairs, global government affairs space, and the folks you're going to see in corporate strategy or supply chain, global supply chain operations, and those folks. Whereas, historically, if you said you were a trade person or a supply chain person, if you say you're a trade person, you're probably in global government affairs. You may have a background in, you may have a JD, you may have a background, working in government service, and, wherever, whichever government you may represent or may have represented. You probably weren't in corporate strategy. And conversely, if you said you were a supply chain person, you probably were on the kind of the business operations side of the house, not necessarily in government affairs. Now it's if, a good chance that, if you're a supply chain person, you may be in government affairs. If you're a trade person, you may be in corporate strategy or something, related to enterprise risk and an adjacency. And that's kind of the needed conversation that needs to happen between those two sides of the house. I think a lot of the work to break that conversation down, or that barrier down between those two sides of the house, came honestly with the global logistics supply chain disruptions from COVID, as you mentioned, kind of one of the recent drivers of a lot of client and corporate conversation the last couple of years. But obviously now we've kind of come full circle to a much more robust trade conversation. I think a lot of companies, you mentioned your opening, focus of OWIT on resilience and transparency in supply chains. I think a lot of the, the kind of the sea legs and kind of just building that transparency, what are your tier one, tier two, tier three suppliers? And a lot of the groundwork that really was, well, that in large part came out of the global supply chain logistics disruptions from COVID, is really, I think, better position companies to weather what's coming in the international trade policy space now and in the next couple of years.
Absolutely. I can guarantee you, I wear all of those hats within my company as well. And this is one of those topics that everyone is talking about wherever you sit within the organization. Okay, so let's get into it a little bit. Let's define tariffs, because there's a lot of question about, like, what are tariffs? Are they different from duties? Are they a tax? What are the tariffs, and who pays them?
Yeah, and you could essentially think of a tariff as a duty or a tax, essentially a fee applied to imports into a country, applied, based on usually the value of that import as a percentage of the value of the import. On who pays, then that's obviously certainly a popular and somewhat political question. Although I want to share some other thoughts on the way you've heard the talk about who pays migrate and change between the two pieces of Trump 1.0 versus Trump 2.0. But I mean, when it comes down to it, who pays ultimately is somewhat reflective of the product, somewhat reflective of the sector, somewhat reflective of the size of the business. So if you're a big business that represents a a large percentage of distribution capacity, you may be in a better position to force some of those costs with any cost upstream to suppliers. If you are in a low margin um industry, or if you're talking about a low margin product, this is where you get into kind of economic questions around price elasticity and fungibility. You may or may not be able to pass, essentially internalize some of those costs in your margin. If you don't have a margin, then that's where you get into a conversation around ultimately the consumers are going to be certainly the third area of possible, where those costs are internalized within a supply chain. And that gets to, conversations we currently hear about inflationary pressures from tariffs, things like that. Certainly consumer costs. And what I wanted to talk about in terms of the who pays and kind of illustrative of where we are in the kind of the Trump administration's thinking about it. In the first term of the Trump administration, you didn't really hear a lot about, any cost pass through to consumers. If you heard about those considerations, or even honestly in the run up to this, there was um, a lot of discussion around, well, we heard similar concerns before the Section 301 tariffs were applied. And I don't want to get ahead on the one, two, threes. The tariffs on China, we heard about some of these pressures. We didn't really see those inflationary pressures really until the COVID supply chain disruptions, things like that. That has come full circle in the second Trump administration, where you do hear much more of an open conversation from senior White House officials, from the president in his speech to the joint session of Congress about the fact that there will have to be pain. Some of this cost will certainly be passed through to consumers. I take that shift and even discussion around who pays when it comes to U.S. trade and tariff policy, um, just as a sign that that pain threshold has gone up. Not for consumers, as senior administration officials talk about, but for the administration itself, where there's always an expectation of whether it be, stock market reaction or consumer reaction, and therefore voter reaction to any cost passed through, as being kind of putting a downward pressure on how broad tariffs may be applied. And as I think there is certainly that pain threshold. I think it is higher based on that kind of the changed way they talk about that cost structure. That threshold is higher than it was in the first term.
So that's a hot topic, right? We're seeing it on the news every night. Everyone's comparing the cost of eggs and avocados and what's happening in terms of your home goods and more.
Hmm.
The apparel that you're wearing, like what does that look like? How high are they going to go? What's that cost increase, right? Businesses is trying to figure out where you can absorb some of the costs in the supply
Yeah.
chain. But okay, so tariffs are basically assessed when the product comes in.
Hmm.
And if you're importer of record, that means we're paying as well. So we've talked about tariffs are a tool, but they're a cost, right? They're an additive cost. So let's go backwards just a little bit to the ABCs on trade. So trade folks, we love to talk in acronyms. We talk about FTAs, we talk about GSP. I can go on and on with the T-tips, and you can name it. But just kind of let's level the playing field on sort of the state of play with trade, Jon. And this is going to really then get into what tariffs are being assessed, the counter tariffs, like all the things we're going to talk about tariff text. But can you kind of lay the groundwork for us right now in terms of setting the scene for our global trading system? Where are we?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and certainly takes it up to kind of not lose the forest for the trees conversations. We talk about kind of discrete tariff discussions, putting the perspective back on what does this mean more broadly and in the medium to longer term. And I guess in terms of the ABCs, when you're talking about kind of the global trading system, you can't leave out the WTO. And just for those kind of a level setting for those on the call, I mean, I don't, not to get too deep unless you'd like to on the WTO, essentially it's been for enforcement purposes, non-functional in recent years. As I said, happy to get into why, but that's kind of the major takeaway, just for brevity purposes, on kind of its role, or at this point, its lack of a role in the international trading system. I think what that means is going to largely be dependent upon where you sit. So, I just, I sit in Washington, as do you, Angela. Um, and I try not to just speak from kind of the US or American trade policy perspective, because you're seeing different things in different economies and different regions and different approaches. I think the fact that you don't have that enforcement mechanism capacity that is functioning at the WTO level, you're seeing a few things. You're seeing a regionalization of trade. Obviously, that takes time. As I would imagine folks on the call recognize, companies can't just up and move supply chains overnight. This gets back to your discussion, of resilience, whether that means a movement of supply chains or identification of, alternative sourcing or redundant sourcing and manufacturing to build in that transparency, that resilience, but a regionalization, essentially moving elements of that supply chain closer to your principal consumption markets. The way that's being reinforced in the absence of kind of a WTO-led kind of infrastructure around global trade is not necessarily with the US, but a number of economies. Europe is one that I think of. They take a very different approach. I mean, you're seeing movement towards, I would say, economic security more than protectionism when it comes to China, but at the same time, their view of supply chain resilience is not necessarily to throw up barriers to trade, but to diversify its trade through FTA or market access negotiations, to ease the kind of commercial engagement with preferred trading partners. And that's where regional trade agreements, I think, will play an increasingly, pronounced role, where if you don't have that enforcement at the WTO level to kind of make sure that there are rules of the road, you can have that through RTAs, regional trade agreements, through enforcement mechanisms to be included there, to at least provide some kind of surety in your trading relationships between countries. I think the US is on a bit of a different course. But I'd say that more to at the higher level, to not just speak from kind of a US trade and tariff policy, and happy to talk about its adjacencies and export controls and investment screening as well. But not just to speak from a US perspective.
Absolutely. And, as we're looking at supply chains, right, everyone's trying to figure out, where are the countries that might have the most certainty in those agreements, if that's a free trade country, or
Mhm.
programs that are preference programs, but some of those are expiring, right? What does that look like? So everyone's looking for sort of where do we sort of move or shift according to policy to, again, keep those costs lowered, right? That's that at the end of the day, efficiencies and costs. Okay, so a little bit of the ABCs. Let's go to the 1, 2, 3s. So part of these mechanisms, and we've just seen an uptick in sort of trade enforcement,
Mhm.
and as you mentioned, WTO, not really functioning dispute settlement mechanism, not functioning, no appellate body. So there have been more countries taking sort of the responsibility, using tools in their own toolkit. Now we're
Mhm.
going to get into the numbers. So we've been hearing things like 201, 232, 301. These are all sort of unilateral enforcement tools. So let's talk about that a little bit too, because that gets us starting the conversation about, so what do those tools allow us to do? But let's break those down, John.
Yeah, so a lot of the numbers, and I would also caveat that by saying the numbers you threw out there, the 201, the 232, the 301, those are all numbers that we saw. So first of all, once again, just to kind of separate US from international, these are US legal trade policy tools that are essentially sections derived from various trade laws, whether it be a trade act or whatever, which difference based on the number. I would separate them based on tariff policy that is applied by country versus applied by product would be one differentiator. But then the other one I would note, the three you listed once again were term one. We're looking at an expanded list, and I know we're going to get into IEPA for term two, into 338 and 122, and a couple others, honestly, that haven't really been even considered for decades in many cases. But for those numbers, so if you look at the 232, which is one that we saw announced yesterday with autos, for example. The 232, Section 232 process and tariff is one that is that the Commerce Department has principal statutory authority for administering the 232 process. Usually the way with any of these or all of them, IEPA is different and maybe 122. There are defined processes for implementation. So, common characteristics, you're going to have a statutory investigation period, may take a number of months. You're going to have a public comment period, all those types of things that will sit between and create kind of a lead, a lag time between the announcement of an investigation and the potential application of the tariff. And that's common for a lot of these things, regardless of who actually administers them. The 232 is a product specific tariff application. So you're going to see that's why it's applied to, in the case of what was announced yesterday, autos globally. Metals, which was one that was a 232 tariff dating from the first Trump administration, although those tariff levels were adjusted for steel and aluminum recently, now moving forward with copper and a number of others. Those are more product specific. The 301s are going to be on a particular country. Now they will be product by product, tariff line by tariff line, but they're going to be, you're not going to have a 301 on all countries, for example. It would be quite onerous to do that. But they're going to be more product specific. 201, for example. 201 is not one you've heard as much from this administration on. That was something that we saw on solar panels and washing machines in the first term. So I don't see that playing as much of a role in the second term. 201 and 301 are administered by the U.S. Trade Representative's Office. So 232 out of the Commerce Department. The drivers of them are also different and somewhat important. The 232, I would say, is particularly of note, not just because you have the Commerce Department administering it, but also because the underpinnings of a 232 tariff are national security considerations. So if there is a kind of a national or economic security consideration underpinning the kind of the commercial impairment or threat faced by U.S. commercial entities, that's where 232 could be applied. And that's the driving rationale, for example, for metals. Happy to get into, but I mean, I don't want to dispute kind of the rationale as to why it was applied to this or that, because that could be certainly open for debate. But applied to metals, applied to cars, or will be applied to cars come, I think the duties go into effect next Thursday. But then there are going to be others as well that they're considering: pharmaceuticals, semiconductors, a few others.
So John, quick
yeah.
question while you're talking about this, but to be clear, the trade, these are items that also they have investigations or they may have recommendations, either product specific, right?
Yes.
Country specific, like country and product. And there's a process that the industry can participate in, even to get exemptions or exclusions. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's what I was saying. Kind of the commonality between all of these, regardless of kind of the the driving tariff or non-tariff barrier that it seeks to address, or who has principal statutory responsibility for them. The common theme is a standard process of investigation, a public comment, and those types of things you're talking about. I would say there's a caveat in the second Trump administration, and we saw that with the announcement of the autos tariffs yesterday. Where the tariffs that were announced on autos, 25% tariffs on autos, finished autos that were not made in America, and they need to do some further fleshing out on how you define made in America, speaking to kind of supply chains are globally integrated at this point, and then also on auto parts, but Commerce has to put together kind of a way of looking at that and defining, once again, what is an American-made auto part. This is something that, while they initiated or they announced the 232 tariff application, it is not going through that process. The reason being is they did that process, or what the administration is arguing is that they went through that process, that Section 232 autos investigation in 2019 in the first term of the Trump administration. Therefore, they are going to use that initial investigation, the tariffs were not applied, and essentially apply them now. And this speaks to something that they're looking at over and over again, are not just an expanded tools list, but also ways to essentially truncate the time to apply the tariffs where possible. Whether in this case it be leveraging the 2019 investigation for other possible tariffs, using potential areas of analysis that were kicked off with the January 20th America First Trade Policy Executive Order, if that could be leveraged to kind of truncate that time, and other ways as well. I will say overall, the Trump administration and the trade policy folks and the trade attorneys around the administration are very good about finding ways to get the president to where he wants to go in trade policy, as quickly as possible. But then also, as I mentioned, kind of the new tools, even leveraging tools or revisiting tools that we long forgotten in decades. So that may be, I don't want to misrepresent the opportunity for companies to weigh into that traditional process, because you may see efforts to kind of truncate that timeline and circumvent it a little bit as well. And that kind of circumvention opportunity or way to roll out tariffs more quickly than brings us to IEPA. I don't know if you want to go to that next. I'm happy to kind of go in a
Oh,
different
yeah, I'm
direction.
definitely going there, right? So even from a company perspective, right, we've been thinking about planning, let me try that one more time, developing supply chains around a lot of these trade mechanisms, looking at nearshoring, onshoring, and more. But
Mhm.
this year started out with quite a bang with a new topic
Yes.
called IEPA, which is an Emergency Powers Act. Now, John mentioned the 232s. That was a national security measure as well. Before I go to IEPA, though, I want to talk a little bit about some of the results from some of those measures, because I think some of our national security partners
Mhm.
felt as if perhaps these were not measures that should be applied to them. And we saw a counter tariff activity. Let's talk on the counter tariffs, and then we're going to go to IEPA first. So what was some of the resulting counter tariffs? How did those work, and what did they look like?
Yeah, from trading partners, whether it be the 232 tariffs or the 301s in the case of China in the first term, and even the ones that we've seen applied thus far using IEPA, which we'll get back to, countries are at a bit of a crossroads, where there's interest in retaliation. In many cases, there's political drive domestically within those countries to retaliate. Where I think we're seeing a mixed bag in terms of the ways to counter tariffs. I would say China has comparatively more tools to do so. But most countries are on a bit of a continuum where, on the more aggressive side in terms of a tariff retaliation, they're looking at it's hard to do one-to-one retaliation in the case of many countries, simply because given the nature of the bilateral goods trade deficit that the U.S. holds with those countries, meaning that the U.S. imports more from those countries than it exports to those countries, you can't go one-to-one on a purely goods tariff basis, because there's just not enough to tariff of U.S. exports given the nature of the bilateral goods trade. Usually countries will then look at targeting specific sectors of the U.S. economy. Um, Ag is usually at or near the top of that list for many countries. Agriculture, just given the nature of the fact that the U.S. exports a lot of ag, but also given the fact that agriculture is particularly politically sensitive in the U.S. Angela, I'm sure you've heard the saying, every state has two senators and at least two cows. Think along those lines, where that, it's kind of a tried and true opportunity for countries to pressure politically sensitive ag states to then prevail upon the administration to revisit their tariff policy. So that's usually one. Geographic indicators and brands closely associated with the U.S. is usually another one. If countries have less opportunity for a one-to-one response, they're going to target it where there's greater political sensitivity. Geographic indicators in the case of the U.S., think bourbon from Kentucky, where these are things that are specifically associated with the U.S. that kind of packs a little bit more political punch in terms of retaliation. Happy to get into China as well, if you want to go down the kind of other retaliatory opportunities route. So that's kind of, for many countries, the most aggressive type response. However, in the case of most countries, and I would say this is particularly true for a lot of emerging markets that still view the U.S. as a considerable export market opportunity, they essentially, and I don't want to pick on Vietnam, but Vietnam is usually kind of a good illustration or kind of an example of this. They still have the mindset of the first term where, with President Trump being the deal maker, where he's always open to a deal, and he is, where there's an opportunity to limit or mitigate tariff exposure coming from the U.S., by finding, something like a goods purchasing agreement, putting some package like that together, which usually includes things like U.S. ag exports, U.S. energy exports, planes, things like that, depending upon the nature of the economy, what they could actually, what they're responsible for actually buying. So I think for many of those countries, the retaliation is going to be a bit of a last resort because they want to try to preserve that deal space. And even for the countries that are looking to push back on U.S. trade and tariff activity, um, through things like, retaliation on ag and GIs and others, they're also sensitive to that deal space. So there's not much interest in kind of one-upping the U.S. As much as doing what's necessary to demonstrate pushback, but at the same time maintaining that opportunity to find a deal to kind of ratchet down the tension.
So that old adage, consumers, no one wins in a global trade war, right? If we look at the scene setter we started with, the whole purpose of the global trading system is to bring more affordable, quality, low-cost goods, right, around the world, looking at economic benefits, looking at regional development and more, right? So we're kind of going the reverse if we're tariffing on tariffing on tariffing. Okay, so we started off the year again with a bang, right? Lots of tariff talk. And a new term, we've started to talk about it, this IEPA, emergency powers. And again, using tariffs now as a tool, right, to solve non-trade issues. So let's talk about IEPA because that's really driving a lot of the tariff talk now.
Yeah, so IEPA, as you mentioned, is an acronym for the International Emergency Economic Powers Act. It has not previously, prior to this administration, been used for tariff application, usually for sanctions, things like that. It was used in the first term of the Trump administration, but once again, not for tariff activity. This is partly reflective, honestly, of something the former USTR Bob Lighthizer and current USTR Jamison Greer believe, that wherever possible, they'd like to go through a normal, tariff application process, getting back to the numbers, the 301s, the 232s, because they find them to be more durable across administrations. Whereas IEPA benefits from a few things, depending upon how you describe a benefit. It benefits from a lack of process. We talked a lot about, the process that may take, in many cases, take months to apply, some of the more normal tariff activity. IEPA really can be drafted up in an executive order quite quickly. It really, it's only process, if you want to use that term loosely. It does not include necessarily input from the private sector. It really, as long as the White House counsel or USTR counsel believe it is legally defensible, then it's something that they can move forward with. I mean, a big proponent of this tool in the current and first administration is somebody named Peter Navarro. I think of Peter as almost like the Elon Musk of trade, where essentially, no process, we're going to do it now, we're going to do it all right now. And this is kind of an enabling tool for that mentality. It also, I would say, benefits from something, and I should have mentioned this with the 232 process, because you even saw the Biden administration defend Section 232 tariffs at the WTO, essentially with the claim that, if a country says that something is a national security issue, or in the case of IEPA, international economic emergency, is non-justiciable, meaning it's not something that can be reviewed by the WTO. It's not something that can be reviewed by, and you're going to probably, certainly with the U.S., increasingly see this carve out in a number of regional trade agreements, probably including the conversation for the 2026 USMCA renewal as well, where that it just, once again, it makes it more enduring because there are just fewer kind of administrative checks to possibly lead to a rollback of some of these economic or national security tariff measures. So that's a little bit about IEPA. It's something that the president is now very cognizant of. You mentioned kind of the one-off country tariff threats. In his confirmation testimony, Howard Lutnick, the now Commerce Secretary, and we at Eurasia Group, we have kind of two buckets, principally country-specific tariffs and product tariffs. Howard has his own two buckets, and those are post-April defined framework tariff rollout, and then one-off tariffs that the president may use as leverage for kind of discrete foreign policy ends. So think immigration, fentanyl, maybe NATO contributions, whatever that may be. We saw that on Venezuela with oil as well, which are kind of hard to predict. But once again, it's that lack of runway, that harder to predict, obviously creates, a lot of volatility. And it's not something that markets can necessarily anticipate, because you would have to essentially have a crystal ball as to any like foreign policy issue that may come up where tariffs might be used then as a measure or as leverage to negotiate a resolution or compromise or whatever it might be for that foreign policy issue. And IEPA, just given the fact that it can be implemented so quickly, and is, kind of the extent or scope of its application has not really been significantly legally tested. It's broad application in theory, at least. That's why that's become such a prominent tool for some of those issues.
So I'm going to ask a follow-up there because, again, we're trying to plan supply chains. We're looking at, the markets that have trade issues that we're trying to resolve. And we often know those numbers, whether it's a 10 or 15 or 20, like that goes through a process to understand where the numbers are. With IEPA, we're solving foreign policy issues, right? Really hard to predict where that may happen or sort of what the parameters are
Mhm.
around these types of tariffs. I mean, are they time bound on the tariffs? Is there a cap on the tariffs? Like, how do those numbers get picked? How does the time? It seems like we've been watching over the last, several weeks, tariffs go on and they pause and then they get
Yeah.
delayed, but then they come back, but then they change. Like, explain this IEPA tariff bit.
Yeah, so on the time bound, and then to your question on the kind of the market gyrations that applied and then paused and all that. On So IEPA is to a degree time bound. It requires, I believe, a congressional review or a review after 1 year, but still a fair amount of time. One of the ways that, and I mentioned kind of Bob Lighthizer or Jameson Greer, the way they view that tariff durability, that enduring nature beyond administration, and preference for more traditional tariff application. There is increasing openness to even using IEPA too, and we talked about that runway, that lag time created by the investigation process, to fill that gap of time with immediate application concurrent with an investigation. So you have an immediate tariff as you put something more enduring into practice. And we may see that with the reciprocal tariffs next week. Um, so yes, there is a time bound. It can be challenged in courts. It has been. Um, with, I would say, mixed results. So that most of the court challenges have been more on the kind of the discrete sanctions, not broad tariff application side. I'm not a trade attorney. I'm not any type of attorney. So I don't want to get into, how open courts would be at various levels to, overturn large swaths of U.S. international economic policy and trade policy. If you look at the challenges to the 301 section list 3 and 4 through the Court of International Trade, probably some hesitance to overturn that, but I guess that we'll have to wait and see on. On kind of the gyrations, I think this is the use of IEPA and its quick application has created almost a difference of opinion on the way these tariff policies should be rolled out. I mentioned Peter Navarro, senior trade counselor to the president, was in the first term as well. Essentially, he's reprising his old role. It may have a little bit of a title shift. He is much more the proponent of IEPA use. If you look at kind of the other end of the spectrum of senior economic policy folks, advising the president, you're looking at, on the other end of the scale, kind of the Scott Bessents, the Treasury Secretary, Kevin Hassett's, the Director of the National Economic Council, their world, with Howard Lutnick kind of sitting in between, and Howard trying to put a lot of this through a more defined, rationalized rollout framework. This is why you heard him constantly, in the past few months say, well, let's give this time, let's push it to that post-April time frame when we have kind of the results of all the January 20th areas of trade analysis, all of that. And that's how we came to April 2nd, because he didn't want to do April Fool's Day. But that's where you have a difference of rollout opinion. It's not a difference of opinion on where U.S. trade policy needs to go, because I think the president has been increasingly clear on that, and happy to talk about that in a second. But essentially, should we do it now? Essentially immediate implementation of what the president would like, or should it once again be put through a bit more of a rationalized rollout and framework? And that's where you particularly saw with the IEPA-based 25% Canada and Mexico tariff signed a few weeks ago now, about a little under a month ago now. And then the immediate rollback first of auto-specific tariffs after concerns were expressed from the big three automakers in the US. And that has a tie to what we saw yesterday on the 232 side. But then immediately after that for US MCA compliant goods for that 1 month adjustment time period. Once again, trying to push it back into that post-April, that more, planned rollout process. But as I said, that's more of a disagreement between the way the way trade policy should be implemented, not the direction of U.S. trade policy. And I think the direction more broadly of U.S. trade policy is less what I've been calling dealability, kind of that use of trade policy largely as leverage to negotiate things. Like in the first term, negotiate, purchasing agreements to shrink the bilateral goods trade deficit, for example. But you're looking at more foundational concerns. I think particularly in this term, it's more focused on the use of trade policy as a buttress to broader industrial strategy to encourage that reshoring to the U.S. And that's where the dealability goes down. If you have a whole lot, you essentially deal away a whole number of these tariffs. It creates a whole bunch of walls in that tariff wall that the U.S. has talked to, or the president's talked about building around the U.S. So I think it's a much more foundational, long-term vision than necessarily the ability to deal all of these tariffs away for discrete ends. But yeah, I think the IEEPA versus the kind of the planned rollout is more just a difference of opinion on rollout strategy rather than end goal.
Thanks, John. Well, and it's interesting. I see we've got some long-term policy warriors on this call. Hi, Jessica Wasserman. So I'm going to give a little bit of a teaser. Start asking your questions, put them in the Q&A because we want to get to these. But now I'm going to go the teaser. So we talked about April 2nd, this Trade Liberation Day and reciprocal tariffs. I mean, this is a new term for those of us who have been in the trade world for a long time. What the dickens is a reciprocal tariff? How do these things work?
Well,
And this may be a trick question.
What it is in theory and what it is that we may see in practice next Wednesday may not be the same. So in the first term, and one of my roles there was communique negotiator for G7, G20, APEC, those types of multilats. We could not agree to anything, where we had to insert language in any communique where you would traditionally have free trade being cited, that we would have to add fair and reciprocal. So that reciprocity, that fairness is something that the president really prioritizes. So when he's talking about reciprocal, I think what the vision is if you tariff, X at certain rates for U.S. exports, you are going to be tariffed at that same rate. Now the challenge is like the U.S. doesn't import and export the same thing. So, if the U.S. is importing a lot of semiconductors but not exporting many semiconductors, if you tariff at the reciprocal rate, it wouldn't make a whole lot of sense necessarily. So I think the broader vision initially was to identify country by country the average weighted reciprocal tariff rate. So here is the average rate across all products that you impose, that tariff rate that you impose on U.S. exports to your country. We are going to, in a sense of fairness, apply that same reciprocal rate on imports from your country. That has expanded and changed a bit. So more likely, and this has gone through a number of different iterations, what we're likely to see in terms of the way a reciprocal tariff is actually applied next Wednesday is not just that, that calculated average weighted tariff rate, that reciprocal tariff rate, but they are looking to add, where possible, other non-tariff barriers and even taxes to that rate, to try to come up with, what they're calculating to be the actual impairment to U.S. commercial access to those countries. Now, some of those are, those calculations are ongoing and have been. Some of them are it's hard to, for, over 200 countries in the UN system, identify and calculate the commercial impairment value for every non-tariff barrier, because also the question like how far that could be quite expansive, and that's kind of the headwind they're running into now. One of the reasons, so when the president signed his memorandum, kind of initiating this reciprocal tariff effort, that's when Howard Lutnick jumped in once again and said, "Well, we can have this done by beginning of April." because they were leveraging a lot of the areas of analysis that had gotten kicked off on January 20th with that executive trade executive order. Um, they are still trying their best to find out what that in their estimation that total summed reciprocal rate will be, and that's where we've heard in recent days it may not be as high as you might fear. And that's because, quite frankly, it's hard to calculate all this stuff, and they're running out of time. So I think that the average reciprocal weighted tariff rate is probably more reflective of what you're going to see that country by country, rate end up being, rather than all these, trying to calculate all these non-tariff barriers. Those can be addressed potentially in the future through, let's say, a 301 response to a digital services tax, whatever it may be. But maybe more on that side, just because of the difficulty of doing these extremely complex global calculations in such a short period of time.
I mean, it's so complex, right? There's times when I just feel like I need to take out my magic 8 ball and shake it and say, what is it going to be? But challenging for planning, right? And thinking about, are these short term, are they long term? If you're in a business, you're looking at those projections right now. If you're looking at the economy right now, consumers are not reacting very well to this as well. So what do those categories look like? How do you plan? How do you strategize for it? I see a great question from our friend Susan Baca in Canada. So speaking of this topic, Susan asks, what do you think is the outlook for the USMCA, so the US, Mexico, Canada renegotiation? So that is up for discussion this year. If duty-free access disappears and tariffs continue against Canada and Mexico, there seems to be no rationale left for a North American free trade agreement. What do you think, John?
Yes, I've certainly heard that. So I mean, I can give you my point of view, as a holding pattern until we see what actually happens next week, which I think will inform the outlook for USMCA renegotiation more broadly. I'll tell you right now, my expectation is you will have the 25% Canada Mexico tariffs roll on with the carve out for 10% for Canadian energy. With an expiration of the exemptions for USMCA compliant goods. I do not think that will be on top of whatever the reciprocal rate ends up being calculated as. I think in the near term, there will be interest in the Trump administration to negotiate back to that reciprocal level in advance of, kind of the more formal USMCA renegotiation. If that is true, that pattern holds, there are a number of opportunities that exist between now and the renegotiation period to have those conversations with Canada and Mexico, specific to Canada and Mexico. One is, now that elections have been called in Canada for the end of April, whether it's a, continuation of Mark Carney or a Poilievre government, at least it moves beyond kind of the heightened political rhetoric within Canada, which I think is, I mean, it's obviously driven by what's coming from Washington, but at least it will take it out of an immediately political context. You move beyond the electoral process, and at least it creates an opportunity for a fresh start to have, more robust, at least one-off bilateral negotiations with Canada and Mexico. And also note, just in terms of a process discussion, Trump likes bilateral trade negotiations because, once again, he views them as leverageable, and he views them as, if you're in a bilateral negotiation with the U.S., the U.S. is probably going to be the 800-pound gorilla in the room. It just maximizes that leverageability. You can't have that with a trilateral, and that's why I think you would have kind of bilateral discussion. So that's kind of one opportunity is the elections in Canada. The next one might be the meeting of the G7, particularly if the next government in Canada would, for example, invite Claudia Sheinbaum, the president of Mexico, as an outside observer, given the fact that they have hosting privileges, might create another opportunity to revisit those tariff levels. If they all stand, and right now I think you'll probably be, once those negotiations commence, at reciprocal tariff rates, not 25%. I think there's a recognition around Trump, particularly for the trade policy folks. You have to provide some reliable assurances that once we come to an agreement on what USMCA will look like after the 6-year periodic review, if they reach an agreement, rather than punt to annual reviews or somebody leaves, for example, I don't put a lot of stock in that, then there has to be assurances that you're not going to continue with these one-off tariff threats for discrete ends of fentanyl or immigration or whatever it may be. I think at this point, from Canada, we'll have to wait and see, particularly if there's even a belief in the reliability of word from Washington on whether or not, once that renegotiation period has ended, whether or not they would even accept or have the belief that the U.S. would not do that. I don't know. That's a Canadian question. But at least from the Trump team perspective, that there's a recognition that that we can't keep doing this, otherwise there's no USMCA at all. Yep. Angela, I think you're muted.
Okay, I'm going to unmute Jessica Wasserman, who has her hand raised. Jessica,
Can you hear me,
for
you guys?
a long time. We can. We're going to give you the last question honor.
Oh, wow. Well, I hope that I don't blow it because I've been triple tasking here and you may have already discussed this, but if so, just move on to another question. But with regard to the EU, that is supposed to be a big focus of April 2nd. And I'd been hearing a lot about how because this is one question I'd been wondering, is this going to be on the EU as a whole, the EC, or is it going to be country by country? And I've been hearing that they are looking country by country with a big focus on the VAT, which I didn't realize how high the VATs are. So it's just kind of like, it's like an added 20%, 5%, 10%, depending on the country. Does that ring true to you?
So I mentioned in the way they're looking at calculating the reciprocal tariffs, the taxes are something that they're considering entirely owed to the European VAT. I don't know, just given how much that would escalate the tariff rate, if in the end that will be included. It probably depends upon, how standardized that they can make kind of their calculation approach across countries. So I'm not sure if that will end up in there in the end. I would probably put over 50% on it simply because it is such a hyper focus, something the president is personally concerned about, including VAT. Now, that said, there are other things that are coming down the pike that I don't think that are less likely in the transatlantic trade space to be included, simply because I don't know if they'll have enough time to include them. I mentioned DST and the outlook there. The U.S. has obviously pulled out of kind of the negotiations that were putting a hold on implementation at the OECD. You're going to have, and I guarantee if this is not included, a tariff response to this is the implementation of CBAM duties in 2026. Everyone talks about USMCA. People forget about, well, not everyone, but some people, I think it's overshadowed CBAM to a degree. That will certainly receive a tariff response. I don't know whether that'd be included in the reciprocal rate or something they would address next year. But there are going to be other things as well. So I don't know what will ultimately be summed into that. I've heard mixed as to whether or not it will be EU-wide or country or member state specific. There are those who are, looking, I think, from a kind of a strategic perspective to just go after the countries that have the largest number of trade red flags to the opinion of the administration. If you look, once again, a lot of focus on bilateral goods trade deficit. If you look at Germany, obviously we had the action on autos. You're going to have those member states as well, but the retaliation will be EU-wide, obviously, just given kind of the trade remit out of Brussels. So I don't know if they've even come to a final conclusion on that. I know Scott Bessent's talked about his Dirty 15, I think is what he's calling it. That would include individual member states, not EU. From our perspective, we did from Eurasia Group, we're looking at it EU-wide. And then also including in a number of particularly ASEAN countries where you have a concern both over the growth of the bilateral goods trade deficit, the top line of the trade deficit, and then also another, I would say, a term two red flag for the administration and a contributor to the kind of that supply chain diversification exacerbating those issues is the incidence of Chinese outbound investment in third countries to circumvent 301 to maintain that low tariff market access to the U.S. So yeah, so don't know, but I would whatever that reciprocal rate is, I think that'll be instructive because if it's kind of all encompassing, quite frankly, while more damaging in the near term, it may actually provide a little bit of surety if they include a lot of those other things in there. Otherwise, I would expect to look for them in the next year or two.
Yeah, great question. And again, we're going to continue to have these discussions as we're continuing the In the Know series. We'll be revisiting what's happening with USMCA. We'll be looking at some of the preference programs that are either expiring or would they be extended. We're going to continue this series because, again, at the end of the day, it's really tricky to navigate. So not to make this difficult, but in 2 minutes, what advice do you have, Jon, for a number of companies and particularly small businesses? We have a lot of entrepreneurs, right, who are members of OWIT globally. How do you get your hands around this? How do you navigate it? Do we panic now? Do we watch it? Like, what advice do you have? I'm going to give you 2 minutes.
I mean, as I said at the outset, I think for many companies, they are already on the right path because many of them are already considering, kind of the movement from just in time to just in case, moving their view of what should drive and advise their global supply chain strategy away from pure cost considerations and towards resilience, transparency, redundancy, things like that. But I think overall, adaptability and versatility is going to be key here because we don't know what's coming. It may be that, we're forced into a game of tariff arbitrage, depending upon the sourcing country. That may change. I mean, quite frankly, even with next Wednesday, I would expect kind of a tiered approach with a few countries that represent a lot of trade to be hit early. The problem is that it's going to just drive trade diversion into countries that are not hit. Once again, that arbitrage discussion. Then in the long term, it's going to put more pressure for tariffing those countries as well. So that's where I think just that transparency and that adaptability are kind of the two key words on addressing what's coming, because there's a lot of uncertainty on what's coming.
I think that's great. Have a plan A, have plan B, have a plan C, and be ready for anything. So, but also keep reading, right? Be in the know, participate in webinars and workshops like this, keep asking the questions, be part of your network. That's a really powerful part of OWIT. We have colleagues, literally, I've been watching the chat and who's on the line here all over the world, right? Your perspectives are critically important to talk to each other, network with each other, and exchange this information as well. So Jon, just the last word I'm going to say in here, speaking of the power of networking. You've been great to join us today, and we really appreciate your expertise and insight as well. From just a professional perspective in your career, how important has networking been and sort of engagement in what you do?
Yeah, it's been enormously important because, I talked about kind of the two sides of the conversational divide, given which side of the house you may sit on in corporate America, or if you're on the policy side. There is, and especially as you have companies or countries, particularly the US and Europe, that are for the first time really diving headfirst into broader, more formalized industrial strategies. If companies don't understand the full nature of their supply chains, governments certainly don't. And that's where that network and that conversation needs to happen, because nobody's going to have the full picture. And given the level of uncertainty, it just puts more onus on developing and cultivating that network and having those conversations to really, weather this as best as possible.
Absolutely. So please join me in thanking Jon for a fantastic conversation on tariffs, tariffs, and tariffs. This is a topic I'm sure we will continue to talk about over the next year, the next duration term. Be watching what's going to be happening next week on April 2nd. And what will happen there as well. But Jon, if they want to contact you as well, you are a senior advisor at Eurasia Group. This is what you do in your wheelhouse. I'm sure you'd be happy to share your information there as well. And for more information about OWIT, you can find us at www.owit.org. So thanks everyone for joining us today. And this will conclude our session.
Thanks, everyone.